Larry Johnson joins us again on the mother of all talk shows. Larry, we've missed you. It's been too long. Let me cut right to the chase. Is NATO going to escalate the war in Ukraine?
Yes, they already are. But they have the desire, but they don't actually have the means we're discovering. The number of different European states, as well as the United States, coming out and acknowledging that they do not have the ammunition in store, they don't have the tanks in store, they don't have the artillery shells in store, but by golly, we're going to get them to you eventually. They're doing everything they can to sustain this conflict, and it keeps blowing up on them. The West, in my view, they've become like Wile E. Coyote from the old Roadrunner cartoons. Every attempt they've made to try to trap Russia, it's blown up in their face. And they, instead of taking Russia apart at the seams, instead of dismantling Russia, it's the West, it's NATO's military that's being demilitarized, along with Ukraine, which is being demilitarized. So this is not turning out as the West expected, but they continue, as they did yesterday. Both Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, speaking at the contact group meeting in Brussels, doubled down. We're going to be in this to the end. And then they proceeded to tell just a pack of lies. I don't know if they genuinely believe these or they just feel obligated to spread propaganda.
Well, let me run two scenarios past you that might represent an escalation. One of them more expensive by far than the other. Let's start with the cheaper one. There's a mighty ammunition store just a mile across the border of Transnistria from the Ukraine front line. It's guarded by Russian soldiers. Transnistria is, of course, entirely Russian-speaking people. In fact, it's a kind of throwback to the Soviet era. Lenin stands outside the main football stadium and so on. If the Ukrainian army invaded Transnistria, which is itself a breakaway from Moldova, then a state of war would exist between Transnistria and the Ukraine. Transnistria would request immediate Russian assistance, and we then have another war raging, this time in the sandwich between Ukraine and Moldova. The second, more expensive one, is a Polish attack on Belarusia. There is heavy rumor right now that NATO, through Poland, perhaps arguing that it's doing so individually, not as part of NATO, is about to attack Belarusia, where hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are. What's your idea on both of those hypotheses, Larry?
No, I don't think they're far-fetched at all, George. I think it's very, they are very possible. They're in the realm of possibility for happening. That's one of the reasons why Russia went ahead and built up its forces in Belarus over the last 6 months. They've deployed a substantial amount of armored vehicles, personnel, aircraft, missiles. So they're in a position to respond. I think Poland, if they did that as in an effort to try to create a pretext to invoke Article 5 of NATO to get the rest of NATO in, they'll find out that they will have escalated this to a level that up to this point, Russia, who is fully capable of hitting key military bases and infrastructure in Poland, has not done so. Partly because they don't want to expand the war beyond getting rid of the military in Ukraine. But if the Poles embarked on that endeavor, it would be a game changer. It would expand the war dramatically, but it would also expose the weakness of the West to respond. They're good at talking, but they're not good at delivering right now. The same thing with Transnistria. Again, the Russians ultimately will take that, I believe, before this entire war is over or once a surrender is negotiated by the Ukrainians. But right now, to light the fuse at that end would give again Russia the justification it needs to start attacking targets that it heretofore has shied away from, in order to avoid spreading the conflict beyond the borders of Ukraine. But I think the patience of the Russians on that front is wearing very thin.
What's happening on the Bakhmut front, Larry?
On the which front? Or Bakhmut?
Bakhmut,
yeah,
the
well,
Artemovsk. Yeah.
Yeah, the Russian troops with the Wagner group in the lead are moving from the south and from the north. They're going to try to envelop Bakhmut. At the same time, the Russians, it's almost like if you go fishing and you put bait on your hook and you throw that hook out there, hoping the fish come feed on it. That's what's going on in Bakhmut. Bakhmut is the bait for the Ukrainian military. They keep feeding in men, materiel, supplies, and the Russians keep blowing it up and destroying it. And it's really a way to decimate the Ukrainian military without having to put a lot of Russian troops on the front lines in a formation that would try to do a rapid penetration. So I don't think this is going to. I think this could probably stretch on for at least another couple of weeks. The Russians are quite content. They've got time. There is no urgency for Russia. They're not in a life or death situation in terms of needing to take action militarily on the battlefield. But what they do recognize is that they are now they are engaged in a war with the United States, with Europe. That's why they have forged alliances with China, with India, with South Africa, with Latin American countries. And they recognize a new multipolar world is emerging. The dominance of the United States, the Pax Americana, is coming to an end. And this war in Ukraine is really where it's taking place. So it's not just in Bakhmut. You've got activities down to the south in Zaporizhia. There are also the Russian troops are moving in Mariinka, which up to 3-4 months ago had been a very important place for the Ukrainians in terms of launching artillery strikes into Donetsk, and the capital.
Now, Putin promised to capture the headlines on the anniversary. It's fast approaching, 24, 25 February. It's just around the corner, just over a week from now. Obviously neither of us knows what's in their mind, but any suspicions, any hunches of what those surprises might include, Larry?
Yeah, well, one would be the announcing the reunification of bringing Belarus back into Russia as a member, as part of the Russia Federation, so that Belarus would cease to exist as a country and would become an important republic within the Russian Federation. So that, I think, that is one possibility. And what that would mean then is any attack upon the territory of Belarus would then in the future be definitely an attack on Russia, and bring in, reassure the Belarusians that they have the full support of Moscow. I think that's one possibility. They also may set a deadline for the West to stop supporting Ukraine, and specifically warning about the supply of combat jets and tanks. Up to this point, Russia's under no real pressure to respond to that, because despite promises from Washington and London and Berlin and Warsaw to send tanks, they don't have any really ready to put on a train and send over. And once they get there, who's going to drive them? And who's going to maintain them? And how are they going to get fuel to them? There's a whole logistics chain that has to be taken into account to make them anywhere near operational on the battlefield. So I think up to this point, Russia is letting a lot of that slide, but there will come a moment where that will have to be addressed, and it will be addressed militarily.
What's happening in Washington? What's all this UFO stuff and balloons and so on? Is it, as I implied, Larry, a diversion, or Or should we be worried that Joe Biden has declared war on Uranus or his anus? I'm not sure he knows which.
Is definitely a diversion. What happened with the first balloon? It was a Chinese weather balloon. It was detected by NORAD, which is the North American defense system for detecting objects, even as it took off out of China. So they knew about it weeks in advance. When it approached the Alaskan coast, the general in charge of NORAD made the decision, it's not a hostile threat, we're just going to let it pass. Someone down in the Biden White House found out about this and thought, oh boy, here we got a chance. We can do something that will make Joe look important and tough on the eve of the State of the Union address, which took place 2 weeks ago. And so what they did is they decided, okay, we're going to order a shoot down. And the military tried to explain, look, it's not a threat. And the politicians, commander-in-chief, insisted on it being shot down. The military balked a little bit, saying if you shoot it down over the continental United States, you run the risk that you could potentially kill some U.S. citizens. That won't look good politically. And the Biden said, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. Gets off the coast. Boom, they put it in the water. Well, after that, that general at NORAD was reprimanded very sternly for his failure to act on this balloon. And so what he did, he says, okay, you want a reaction to any threat that comes in, regardless of whether it's hostile or not? Fine. And that's exactly what happened. They were providing warnings on space junk. That's all it was. And so now, all of a sudden, the Biden administration is on its heels because they're incompetent. It is one of the most egregious displays of ignorance in a foreign policy national security team that I have ever seen. And I'm old enough, like you, to have seen some things in my lifetime. So now they're backing away because they've fired $400,000 missiles at maybe $1,000 worth of junk in space or in the air, and in fact some of those missiles went astray, didn't hit their target. So now you got a missing missile flying around somewhere over Lake Michigan. It is pathetic, and Biden's going to have to come out at some point and make some remarks. But I think your comments about Uranus are quite appropriate.
Well, when he makes remarks, he sounds like a Martian. He may, in fact, there may be a Martian inside him. Who knows? His brother is in hot water today because I see in the New York Post, which is leading the way, I must say, in the entire American media about the Biden crime family. His brother is in court on having allegedly brokering a $140 million deal with Saudi Arabia. I don't know if the big guy, whoever he is, was supposed to get 10% of that. Can you tell us anything about it?
I really don't know anything more about it other than let's look at what is now transpiring with respect to Saudi-American relations. That even though the Bidens shook down the Saudis for billions or for millions, what is now happening is that relationship is fractured. There's a fissure developing. You find Saudi Arabia much more willing to enter negotiations with Russia, with China, looking for alternatives for accepting payments for oil instead of relying on the dollar as they have over the last 51 years. So this is, I think, the willingness to take this into court signals that the tide may be turning against the whole Biden family right now. I think the act is wearing a little thin, and Democrats are becoming, I think, increasingly worried about what's next, because at this pace, Biden will not survive. They just, he keeps saying that inflation's down, except the report that came out yesterday showed that inflation actually exceeded what experts were predicting. So it's higher, and it's going to continue to go higher. He's not winning on any front.
What about the Nord Stream front? Finally, Larry, your compatriot, my former collaborator, 40 years ago nearly, Seymour Hersh, no mean journalist, a winner of more journalistic awards than any journalist alive today, multiple Polk Award winner, Pulitzer Prize winner. He's having to write on Substack now because none of the so-called newspapers will write the earth-shattering revelation that he's come up with on the Nord Stream.
Yeah, Cy's been a friend for 42 years. We both have sons named Josh that were born in 1981. He a frequent golf partner of mine up north. But you know, this is. Did you ever see the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray? With these stories that Cy puts out are just like Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over with some slight variations, which means Cy breaks a tremendous story, and the government comes back and says, it's a lie. It's not true. He's crazy, and he only has one source, and it's wrong. And then it turns out it's true. So it didn't matter whether it was his reporting on the My Lai massacre, his reporting about Gulf and Western, his reporting about CIA assassinations, CIA spying on Americans, the story he did with respect to Abu Ghraib, which was cutting edge, and so it goes on. This is just the latest iteration, but as you correctly note, I've watched Cy over the years where he used to be published in the New York Times, then he was in the New Yorker, and then about 8 years ago, he had to move to the London Review of Books, and then from the London Review of Books, he wound up in Der Spiegel. Now he's gone to Substack, but it's actually, he's quite happy about it from the standpoint he no longer has to worry about irritating corporate interests. He no longer has to face a major battle with editors over, oh, this might not be well received. And yet he's still smart enough that he uses an actual editor to help clean the pieces up to make them even punchier and very readable. So he got the story right. And it's just, it's going to take over. The bottom line is this. Russia did not destroy its own pipeline, despite the early propaganda. Somebody in the West did, and Cy's got reliable sources saying it was the United States with the help of the Norwegians and maybe some other countries. But at least the Norwegians were right there to step into the breach the next day once that pipeline disappeared. Hey, we've got some oil and gas to sell you. Here you go.
Cui bono, as they used to say. Larry Johnson, you're a star, man. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.